thick stench of antiseptic filled the air inside the aging van. As officers pulled back the yellow blanket, a pale, bluish face emerged, lifeless, cold. No one could have known it then, but that moment would unravel a chilling chain of crimes. Beneath the mask of a matchmaker stood a calculated killer, one who had turned an ancient ritual into a method of murder. To understand how this tragedy began, we must go back to where it all started. Part 1. The haunting discovery. The rain had just stopped when the patrol unit along Wuhua Road in Wuxi County, Shaanxi Province, waved down a small commercial van. At first glance, it looked ordinary. The driver's documents were in order, his demeanor calm. Yet something about the vehicle felt wrong. The rear seats had been removed, and a heavy yellow blanket was draped over what seemed to be a human figure. When the officers pulled the cover back, silence gripped the roadside. A pale woman lay motionless, her face unnaturally serene, her lips faintly discolored as if the last traces of life had been drained away. There were no visible wounds, no signs of struggle, nothing to suggest the violence one might expect from a murder. But the absence of chaos only deepened the unease. The driver, Yang Shen, avoided eye contact, insisting he was merely transporting a relative of an older man who accompanied him. That man, Ma Sung Hua, presented identification for the deceased, claiming she was Liu Ha, a distant family member. On paper, it all seemed plausible, yet the stillness in that van was unnatural, and the officers' instincts told them they had just stumbled onto something far more disturbing than a simple body transport. A moment later, one of the officers noticed Ma Sung Hua tearing a small piece of paper and trying to dispose of it in a roadside drain. It was a subtle gesture, but in investigations, small gestures often crack cases wide open. The shredded scrap was retrieved, reconstructed, and revealed a phone number 1 that would soon unravel the first thread of a hidden nightmare. From that moment, what seemed like a procedural stop transformed into the opening act of a macabre investigation. This was not merely about a dead woman in a van. Behind her lifeless stare lay a trail of deception, greed, and a ritual so deeply rooted in shadow tradition that it had become a hunting ground for predators. And as the officers would soon learn, this was only the beginning. What they had uncovered on that quiet stretch of road was nothing more than the surface of a darkness far deeper than anyone imagined. Part 2. Tracing the clues. The number on the shredded paper became the first thread in a web of lies. Investigators traced it to a small village in Gansu Province, where it belonged to an elderly woman named Liu Mei, the mother of a missing woman named Liu Ha. When detectives arrived, Liu Mei spoke with a trembling voice. She explained that weeks earlier, a man who introduced himself as Old Liu promised to find a suitable husband for her daughter. Liu Ha had lived a life marked by hardship and mental illness. Desperate to give her child a chance at what she believed was dignity, Liu Mei allowed the stranger to take her away. He gave her a small sum of money and left. That was the last time she saw her daughter alive. This revelation reshaped the investigation. The body in the van, the mysterious driver, and the man who called himself Ma Sung Hua were no longer just participants in an unusual transport. They had stepped into the center of something far darker, something rooted in a ritual known as ghost marriage. In remote parts of northern China, ghost marriage was not merely folklore, but a custom that persisted in silence. Families who lost an unmarried son believed his spirit would remain restless unless he was wed in death. The ritual demanded a bride, and over time, a hidden trade emerged, where desperate people were willing to pay staggering sums for the body of a woman to bury beside their dead. What began as superstition had transformed into a black market where human remains became commodities. For the detectives, this was not superstition, it was motive. And standing before them, Ma Sung Hua seemed to fit perfectly into this grim puzzle. His calm demeanor at the roadside stop, his attempt to destroy the slip of paper, and now his connection to Liu Ha's disappearance painted a chilling portrait. Yet there was still no direct evidence tying him to the corpse in the van or to any act of violence. They pressed deeper. Phone records confirmed that Ma had been in frequent contact with numbers linked to isolated villages known for ghost marriage arrangements. Witness interviews revealed that he was often seen posing as a matchmaker, someone who approached families with promises of marriage prospects. These findings were enough to move the case beyond a simple transport investigation. However, one detail complicated everything. When investigators brought photographs of the dead woman from the van to Liu Ha's family, her brothers insisted she was not their sister. The corpse bore a striking resemblance, but it was not her. This single contradiction pushed the investigation into an entirely new direction. If the body was not Liu Ha, then who was she, and where was Liu Ha now? As this question hung in the air, the shredded paper seemed less like a clue and more like a key. It had opened a door, and beyond it lay a labyrinth where tradition, exploitation, and murder converged. Detectives were no longer simply following a suspicious van. They were tracing the outline of an organized system built on silence and fear. And while Ma Sung Hua remained calm in his denials, the evidence was beginning to speak louder than his words. The case was no longer about one dead woman. It was about uncovering how many others had been taken in the same way. Part 3. The Face of Evil. As investigators delved deeper into the case, the man who had once stood silently by the roadside, feigning calm, began to reveal a darker history. Ma Sung Hua, 61 years old, was not an ordinary matchmaker. His record showed a prior conviction for human trafficking. That revelation reframed him from a suspicious figure into the prime suspect of an organized and calculated scheme. Detectives built a timeline of his movements. He had traveled repeatedly between Gansu and Shaanxi, always lingering near isolated towns where families clung to old customs. Phone records tied him to contacts notorious for arranging ghost marriages. Surveillance confirmed what investigators suspected. Ma was no broker of love. He was a predator who had turned tradition into a market. In interviews, Ma showed no remorse, no trace of guilt. He denied any wrongdoing and insisted that the woman in the van was a distant relative. Yet his responses were deliberate, his tone controlled, as if he believed that his calm performance could mask the stench of his crimes. Investigators who studied his behavior saw the traits of a manipulator, methodical, detached, and utterly convinced of his ability to outsmart the system. Financial records painted an even clearer picture. Payments in cash, transferred discreetly from families of deceased men seeking ghost brides, corresponded with Ma's frequent trips. Each payment ranged from 40 to 50,000 yuan, far more than the cost of any legitimate matchmaking service. He had discovered a lucrative niche in a cruel economy, the sale of corpses disguised as ritual fulfillment. The psychological profile of Ma Sung Hua was damning. Experts described him as opportunistic, capable of exploiting cultural beliefs without hesitation. He targeted women like Liu Ha, mentally vulnerable, socially isolated, and unable to resist. His method was chillingly pragmatic. He would approach their families under the guise of a savior, offering marriage prospects, gain their trust, and remove his victims from their homes without raising suspicion. Once he had control, the victims disappeared, and their silence became his profit. One investigator later remarked, "He knew exactly where to look. He knew who wouldn't fight back. It was a predator's instinct, sharpened not by rage or passion, but by greed and a total absence of empathy." The breakthrough came when detectives compared the DNA of the corpse in the van against national records. The results identified her not as Liu Ha, but as another woman, and Fu Hong. Her family had filed a missing persons report just days earlier. With that single match, Ma Sung Hua's facade collapsed. Two women, both vulnerable, both vanished the same way, both tied to Ma. For investigators, the question was no longer whether he was guilty. It was how many lives had been consumed by his cold and calculated trade. And as they prepared to confront Ma Sung Hua with the evidence, one haunting truth lingered. If this was what they could see, how much more of his darkness remained hidden beneath the surface? Part 4. The Grim Method. The forensic report changed everything. When the results arrived, the sterile language of science cut through every denial Ma Sung Hua had uttered. Inside the bloodstream of An Fu Hong, toxicologists detected a high concentration of a powerful sedative known as lubin cam. In therapeutic doses, it was meant to calm. In the quantities found in her body, it was a weapon. The sedative had suppressed her vital functions until her body could no longer endure it. Investigators now understood that this was not a case of neglect or accident. This was deliberate. The method was precise, controlled, and devastatingly effective. It allowed Ma Sung Hua to kill without leaving the signs of a struggle. Forensic analysts explained that the repeated administration of the drug would have left a victim disoriented and unable to resist, making the final overdose almost inevitable. Armed with this evidence, detectives searched for a location where Ma might have held his victims. The breakthrough came from the driver, Yang Shu-shen, who admitted to transporting a body from a remote area near Kujia village in Ning County. When officers followed the lead, they discovered an abandoned cave, hidden behind a cluster of jagged rocks. Inside, the air was heavy and stale, as if the place itself had absorbed the weight of what had happened there. Scattered across the dirt floor were broken glass vials, syringes still capped with traces of residue, and tattered clothing that matched descriptions given by Liu Ha's family. These were not the remains of chance. They were the tools of a killer who planned his crimes with chilling precision. One investigator later described it as a silent crime scene, where the walls spoke only through what was left behind. The cave told a story, each syringe, each fragment of a vial, reinforcing the narrative that Ma Sung Hua had turned sedation into a weapon. Psychological profiling revealed the escalation of his methods. He began by exploiting the desperation of families, but once he realized how profitable ghost marriages had become, his crimes shifted from manipulation to calculated murder. Experts noted that his actions followed a pattern of functional psychopathy. He was not impulsive. He was disciplined, exploiting cultural blind spots and targeting victims he knew would vanish without raising immediate alarm. Even as he was confronted with the forensic findings, Ma remained calm. He dismissed the evidence as coincidence, claiming that the syringes were medical supplies for the sick. His composure, however, was hollow. The accumulation of proof was no longer a question of suspicion, but of inevitability. The cave was sealed, documented, and preserved as the chamber of a crime that had, until then, existed only in whispers. And with the sedative analysis tying directly to Ma's movements and purchases, the case against him moved from theory to certainty. Yet, for the investigators, one haunting question persisted. If this was how he operated, how many others had disappeared the same way, hidden by tradition and erased by silence? The answer was still buried somewhere in the evidence. And the law was closing in on Ma Sung Hua, ready to expose every secret he thought he had buried. Part 5. Justice and the Curse of Tradition. The arrest of Ma Sung Hua was methodical. Detectives presented him with the toxicology report, the forensic evidence from the cave, and the DNA match for An Fu Hong. When confronted with this chain of proof, his composure fractured. Ma was taken into custody without resistance. His silence during the transfer to the station was not an act of defiance, but a calculated attempt to regain control in a situation where control no longer existed. The trial was built on evidence rather than speculation. Forensic experts demonstrated that the concentration of lubincam found in An Fu Hong's system could only have been administered intentionally. The syringes and vials recovered from the cave were presented in court, establishing both opportunity and method. Financial records linked payments from families seeking ghost marriages directly to Ma. His pattern of movement across Gansu and Shaanxi matched the timeline of the victims' disappearances. Ma Sung Hua was convicted of murder, human trafficking, and unlawful handling of human remains. He was sentenced to death. Yang Shu-shen, the the driver who transported the bodies, was charged with aiding and abetting, but received a lesser sentence for his cooperation during the investigation. The case highlighted a systemic vulnerability. Ghost marriage was not merely a cultural remnant, it had become a mechanism for exploitation. The practice created a market where women from marginalized backgrounds could be targeted, manipulated, and erased with minimal oversight. Each transaction reinforced a cycle where desperation and superstition fueled criminal profit. This behavior indicated a predictable escalation. Ma's initial approach as a fraudulent matchmaker evolved into organized killings once he recognized the profitability of supplying corpses for ritual use. His lack of emotional response during interrogations and his controlled manner of speech reflected a personality structured around calculated detachment. He did not act out of impulse, he acted with deliberation, exploiting the very traditions that should have been preserved only as cultural history, not weaponized as tools for financial gain. The investigation also served as a case study in procedural precision. The recovery of the torn paper, the use of forensic toxicology, and the coordination between regional police units illustrated how incremental findings, when connected, could dismantle even the most methodical criminal plan. Ghost marriage has since faced renewed scrutiny in China. Legal measures against the trade of corpses and the exploitation of cultural customs have been strengthened. Yet the underlying social conditions that allowed Ma to thrive, poverty, isolation, and deeply ingrained superstition, remain unresolved. These factors continue to represent points of vulnerability that law enforcement and community leaders must address. The resolution of the case did not erase its impact. For the families of Liu Ha and Fu Hong, justice came in the form of accountability, but it could not undo the exploitation that turned their loved ones into commodities. Their loss underscored a truth that investigators repeated during the trial: tradition can be manipulated, and when it is, those who are most defenseless pay the price. This case is no longer merely a criminal record. It is a cautionary benchmark. It shows that cultural practices, when distorted by greed, can become the stage for systematic abuse. And it stands as a permanent reminder of the cost of silence and complicity.